The file shouldn't have had my handwriting. I turned the page over once, then again, because that was what training did to you in a place like the Ira Allen Archive Annex. It taught you to distrust surprise before you distrusted paper. The air in the processing room was dry enough to rasp in my throat, thick with old cellulose, faint mildew, and that metallic hint of ozone that came off the climate controls when they kicked on too hard. Somewhere below the concrete floor, something heavy struck in a patient rhythm. Stamp, pause, stamp. It had always been there at night, low enough to ignore if you wanted to keep working. I didn't want to keep working. The signature at the bottom of the authorization slip was mine. Not similar to mine, not a close imitation mine, the same rightward lean on the capital letters, and the same slight hesitation before the second name, where I always slowed as if I were remembering who I was halfway through signing for something. The ink still looked wet. The date at the top was tomorrow. Under the signature, in a field reserved for disposition, was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. Nadia Solis. My fingers went cold. I checked the accession number, the routing code, the audit trail. The terminal beside me already showed the request was completed. Record removed. Cross-references updated. Storage vacancy reassigned. Then the sound under the floor changed. The stamping stopped. I heard pages moving, a soft whisper of paper against paper, like someone leafing through a file with deliberate care. A second later, something below me stamped a date into existence. Tomorrow's date. I remember standing so still that even my breath sounded intrusive in the room, staring at a decision I had not made yet, already logged as done, and thinking only one thing. How was the archive filing what I hadn't decided to destroy? I need to go back to the beginning. The annex sat beneath the older side of the University of Vermont campus, under brick and slate, and the kind of academic self-regard that made even water damage seem historic. Most people who pictured an archive imagined oak tables and white gloves and sun through high windows. The Ira Allen Annex was concrete, steel shelving, motion sensors, compact shelving rails, barcode scanners, and a climate system that ran so steadily you stopped hearing it after a month and then started hearing it again after a year. Because by then you knew silence had a shape, and that building never truly had it. At night, the air changed. It dried out. The paper smell got heavier, less like books and more like dust pulled from sealed boxes. There was always a faint dampness beneath it. Old stone holding weather, and under that, especially in winter, a clean electrical tang that seemed to gather in the back of the throat. If you stayed on shift past midnight, and I usually did, you could hear the building's private noises. The whisper of automatic page feeders in the digitization room. The small clicks from the compact shelving locks cycling through their self-check routines. And beneath all of it, carried through the slab, that distant mechanical stamping. Most of the student staff hated the place after dark. They talked about the annex as if it were haunted, which was lazy language for a university employee, but common enough in Burlington, where old buildings collected legends the way gutters collected leaves. I didn't use that word. I preferred systems. Systems failed. Systems repeated themselves. Systems could be understood. That preference had served me well. I had worked there once before as a doctoral assistant years earlier, back when I still believed the real power of an archive was neutral. Then I had left, finished everything except the part of my own conscience that mattered, and come back in a permanent role because the work suited me and because the annex had always rewarded people who could make themselves small in the face of institutional need. At night, I cataloged legacy administrative records, student conduct files old enough to transfer, donor correspondence, restricted committee minutes, disciplinary paperwork that had aged into history without ever becoming truth. I liked order. I liked the way a mislabeled carton became correct when placed in the right series, the way chaos flattened under a precise hand. That was what I told myself anyway. Bernice Caldwell Rourke ran nights the way some people conducted funerals, with dignity, economy, and no patience for unnecessary speech. She had been in the annex longer than most faculty had been at the university. Her clothes always smelled faintly of starch and old binding glue. She never hurried, and because she never hurried, everyone else ended up moving faster around her. If a record had to be restricted, Bernice restricted it. If a collection had to be split, resequenced, or sealed, Bernice did it without drama. She called the archive a living system, which I had once taken as a metaphor and later understood had not been one. Otis Merrill Duval belonged to facilities and worked the lower levels on nights because, according to him, daytime people generated too many instructions and not enough understanding. He was broad-shouldered, careful, and always smelled like cold air and machine grease. He kept the dehumidifiers alive, replaced fluorescent tubes before they buzzed themselves to death, and knew which concrete walls sweated in October. He had the relaxed caution of someone who spent his life around equipment that could injure you without anger. I trusted both of them in different ways. That mattered more than I knew then. The first few hours of that shift had been ordinary. I was processing a backlog of Provost's office records from the late 1990s, standard retention review box by box, removing duplicates, confirming restriction periods, entering notes in the catalog. The monitor cast everything in a pale institutional glow. My fingertips had gone powdery from old folders. I could hear the whisper of pages from somewhere down the corridor, though I knew I was alone in that section. Looking back, that was the last routine task I completed under my own name. The annex had old schematics in the maintenance binder, brittle blue copies with coffee rings and obsolete room labels. Every time I pulled them for a contractor request or a storage map, I saw the same thing and ignored it with professional discipline. Beneath the lowest marked level, under storage, under microfilm, under HVAC access, there was another notation in faded block print. Sub-basement. No room numbers, no dimensions, no current key assignment. The space had been blanked out in later plans the way institutions blank out anything they no longer want to explain. I had asked about it once years before as a doctoral assistant knew enough to mistake curiosity for belonging. Bernice had said, without looking up from a finding aid, that outdated schematics accumulated fictional spaces the way old ledgers accumulated dead names. Then she had asked me to rebox a donor collection, and I had learned the first practical lesson of archive work. Questions that interrupted operations rarely got second invitations. So when the call slip appeared in my digital queue a few minutes before 1 in the morning, my first assumption was not dread. It was clerical drift, in a sync issue between legacy software and the retention database. An automated import pushing a stale template. Institutions did not need ghosts. They produced errors with more than enough enthusiasm. Then I opened the file. The authorization form was routed from special review. Origin code incomplete, disposition urgent, attached note, removal approved. The handwriting in the margin was mine. Not only mine, but recent mine, the way I wrote now after years of report annotations and accession notes. The younger version of my hand had been tighter. This was the script I used after midnight when my wrist was tired and I stopped trying to make letters appear respectable. There was even a small ink drag on the surname where my pen had once skipped on a humid day and never quite recovered its smoothness. Remove all residual references to Solus Nadia, correction pending. Maintain record consistency. A soft smell of burning paper touched the air and was gone. I sat back slowly. The chair creaked under me. The monitor hummed. Below the floor, the stamping kept its patient interval, as if some unseen office were processing a backlog that would outlast us all. Nadia Solis had been a doctoral candidate in history. She had worked on labor letters, donor-restricted correspondence, a dissertation that depended on a group of accessioned boxes no one was supposed to access until the following spring. She had cited them anyway because she had seen them with permission under supervision. My supervision, for one afternoon that turned into a week of quiet accommodation because faculty bent rules all the time for the right students and because back then I still wanted to be useful to power. Then one donor objected. Then a faculty committee discovered citations to restricted materials that officially had not yet been available. Then someone decided there had been misconduct. Nadia said the archive logs would prove otherwise. The logs would have. I had been the one who found the intake slip in the supervised access note. Bernice had not told me what to do. She never phrased things that directly. She had only reminded me that public scandal would not stop with one graduate student, donor litigation, grant review, faculty resignations, questions about records control, damage to the annex, damage to the university. She had said institutions remembered the people who protected them. So I removed the access note, amended a date field in the internal processing draft, and let the official record harden around the lie that Nadia had fabricated her citations. Her appeal failed. Her advisor withdrew support. Within a month, she was gone, not dead as far as I knew. Just gone in the way academia specialized in, a life nudged off the map and then discussed only as a cautionary tale with no name attached. I had not spoken of her in years. Now the system showed her removal is already complete. I searched the audit trail first because that was what training did. User logs, timestamp chain, source workstation. The file history showed my credentials attached to the action scheduled for tomorrow just after midnight, and then marked fulfilled 5 minutes before I had first opened the queue. That made no procedural sense. It also made an uglier kind of sense than I wanted to admit. I stood, went to the restricted student records bay, keyed in the request number, and waited while compact shelving groaned apart on its tracks. Cold air slid out between the rows. The cardboard smell deepened. I found the correct run, the right sequence, the adjacent student numbers. There was no folder for Nadia Solis. There wasn't even a gap where one should have been. The neighboring folders had shifted flush against each other as if no file had ever occupied that space. I checked old location reports, off-site requests, restoration holds. Nothing. No inactive flag, no transfer note, no withdrawal authorization except the one in my hand dated tomorrow signed by me. And that was the first time I felt something colder than fear. Recognition. I knew now what the smell of burning paper had meant. I didn't then. I took the form to Bernice a little after 1. She was in her glass office at the end of the processing corridor, reading under a green-shaded lamp that made her look older and more deliberate than daylight ever did. The office always smelled of dustless paper, tea gone cool, and the medicinal lemon of conservation paste. When I stepped in, she didn't look startled to see me. That should have bothered me more than it did. She finished the line she was reading, marked her place with a ruler, and looked up. Problem? I put the authorization on her desk. She adjusted her glasses and read it without visible reaction. The lamp buzzed once. Far below us, the stamping continued. This is in my hand, I said. Yes. It's dated tomorrow. Also, yes. The system says the removal is already completed. Bernice set the paper down very carefully. Then the system has gotten ahead of you. I let out a breath that almost became a laugh. That's not an explanation. It's the one you have. Her calm irritated me in a way panic would not have. Panic would have made the thing manageable. This, her tone, made it sound procedural. There is no student file, no gap, no withdrawal trail. Nadia Solis is gone from the run as if she was never assigned a folder. At the name, something tiny changed in her face. Not surprise. Recognition would be too generous a word. It was closer to fatigue. "You shouldn't say names from incomplete files more than once," she said. "I didn't ask for advice on diction." "No, you asked a question I told you years ago not to ask in this building." There was a faint, dry hiss from the vent over her door. The office air felt warmer than the corridor, but my hands had gone numb. "Years ago, you told me outdated schematics invented spaces. Was that also advice?" Bernice folded the authorization and set it inside a blotter. "Alistair, the Annex has always had a way of correcting inconsistencies before staff understand what created them. Most of the time, that is to everyone's benefit." "Corrections?" She nodded once, as if I had finally used the proper term in a meeting. "Routine, usually." "Routine for whom?" "For anyone who intends to keep working here." That should have sent me upstairs. It should have sent me home, or to the police, or into the kind of melodrama night workers mocked in daytime people. Instead, I stood there breathing old paper and lemon and hearing the dull stamp from under the concrete, and I asked the question that had waited years for a bad hour. "What is in the sub-basement?" Bernice reached for her tea, found it cold, and set it back down. "If you are wise, it will remain a line on an old blueprint." "That's not an answer. It's the best one you're going to get tonight." She dismissed me then, not with rudeness, but with the administrative finality that institutions perfect. Conversation over, matter deferred, concern unproductive. I might have obeyed if the blotter on her desk had not shifted when she moved her hand. Under it, just visible, was the corner of a typed sheet on yellowing paper with the word "inconsistent" underlined in pencil. When Bernice stepped out to take a call from preservation, I did something small, cowardly, and entirely in character. I opened her center drawer. The air inside smelled sharper than the rest of the office, like stale carbon paper and cedar from old dividers. There were binders, restricted keys, a box of label clips, and beneath them a thin file folder with no tab. Inside was one typed page and a handful of annotations in the same hard pencil Bernice used on routing slips. The first line said, "Do not catalog any document originating from sub-basement level 3. The word "originating" had been underlined 3 times, then once more in pencil. The second line said, "If a file appears with your handwriting and you do not remember writing it, do not read it." Beside that, in Bernice's hand, was a note. "Too late is still useful." I kept reading. "All records must remain consistent. Inconsistencies will be corrected. Never respond to your name if it is spoken from below. If you encounter a record of someone who does not exist, remove it immediately. If you encounter a record of someone who should exist but does not, do not investigate." There was no letterhead, no committee stamp, no date. Just those 6 instructions typed in an old administrative font and handled enough times that the edges had gone soft. My mouth had gone dry in a room built to preserve dry things. I read the third rule again. All records must remain consistent. Inconsistencies will be corrected. That was the moment the situation changed shape. Until then, I had assumed the problem was a forgery, or a malfunction, or a private cruelty arranged by someone who wanted me frightened. The page in my hand suggested something worse. Not that the annex contained an error, but that it had a policy. I slid the sheet back into place just as Bernice's steps returned to the corridor. The whisper of pages rose somewhere beyond the office walls, too steady to be heard. When she came in, I was standing by the lamp pretending to study the framed fire map. She looked from me to the desk to the closed drawer. If she knew, and I think she did, she chose not to say so. "Go home, Alistair," she said. Instead, I went back to the records floor and started looking for a woman I had already helped disappear. The annex had its own kind of insomnia. After 2 in the morning, the motion sensors dimmed sections of corridor if you stayed too still, and the light came back in pale pulses that made the shelving seem to inhale around you. The paper smell thickened, dust settled differently. You became aware of every small abrasion, folder tabs dragging against knuckle skin, the dry grain of cotton gloves, the cool, ribbed plastic of a barcode scanner. In the silence between the mechanical noises, I could hear pages turning where there were no readers. I didn't search Nadia Solis directly at first. Rule 6 had lodged under my skin. If you encounter a record of someone who should exist but does not, do not investigate. That was too specific to ignore and too relevant to obey. So I approached sideways the way I had been trained to approach restricted material. Context first. Adjacency, cross-references. Every hidden record left impressions in the files around it. Nadia had worked in history, so I checked dissertation approval minutes from the year of her accusation. No Nadia Solis. But in a footnote to a routine vote on travel funding, I found a line about a graduate researcher whose access privileges had been reviewed after citation discrepancies. The name attached was N. Souls. I copied the accession number and followed it to a faculty committee folder. In a memo about donor restrictions, someone had typed that procedures had been revised after the Solis matter. The surname was crossed out in blue pencil and replaced with Solon. Different folders, different hands, same scar showing through. The deeper I went, the more references surfaced. A preservation request initialed by Bernice, citing damage to a box consulted by Nadia S. A grant compliance report noting reputational risk from an unresolved student complaint. Name redacted, but the initials preserved in a metadata field. A microfilm target sheet where the real index jumped over a number and left a handwritten note. Removed after review, NVS. The archive hadn't erased her cleanly. It had smeared her. That was the second revelation. Whatever process governed the annex was not perfect. It was working around damage, not through absence. By then, the building had settled into its pre-dawn temperature. Concrete walls held a deep cold. The metal edge of the table bit into my wrists. My eyes burned from old toner and dry air. I had a spread of notes beside me, all written by hand because I no longer trusted the terminal not to correct what I found while I watched. The whispering under the floor had grown more distinct, not louder exactly, just closer to language. Not words, the texture of words, sibilance brushing against paper. At some point I found myself staring at a citation card and thinking about the afternoon Nadia had first come into the annex years earlier. She had smelled faintly of wet wool and winter air. She talked too fast when she was nervous and stopped abruptly when she noticed she had been doing it. She had thanked me for making time for a restricted consultation as if I were doing something generous instead of routine. When the donor complaint broke and she came back asking whether the access log still existed, I had not looked at her for more than a second. I remember the precise shape of the stapler on the desk between us more clearly than her face, which tells you everything important about the sort of man I was. That was the last honest memory I had of her. Or I thought it was. Alistair. The voice came from below the floor. Not muffled, not distant. Close, intimate. My own voice pitched exactly as I heard it inside my head when I read silently. Calm, precise, unhurried. Alistair? Every hair on my arms rose at once. The room smelled suddenly of cold dust and something sweetly charred, like paper singed at the edge by a bulb. Rule 4 came back whole. Never respond to your name if it is spoken from below. I didn't answer. I didn't move. My pulse thudded in my throat hard enough to hurt. The whisper of turning pages stopped, and in the silence I heard a metal latch click somewhere under the slab. Then my voice from beneath me said one more thing. I kept the note you took out. I do not know how long I sat there after that, hands flat on the table, staring at a footnote with the wrong version of Nadia's name. Long enough for one bank of lights to dim and wake again. Long enough to understand that the annex was no longer interested in whether I believed it. If I'd left then, there might still be a clean record of me anywhere. Instead, I went looking for Otis. Facilities kept a workroom off the loading corridor near the service lift and the old freight ramp that no longer opened to anything but concrete. The closer I got, the stronger the smell of machine oil and damp canvas became, cutting through the archive dust. I found Otis at a steel bench under a task lamp, taking apart a relay housing with the deliberate patience of a surgeon. There was a radio on the shelf behind him, turned low to static because, as he once told me, static was harder to lie through than music. He looked up when I came in. You look like the annex finally introduced itself. I need to ask you something. Most folks ask before they look like that. I closed the door behind me. The service corridor outside had its own acoustics, all hollow concrete and long echoes. Down here, the stamping from below was clearer. Not loud, but impossible to mistake for plumbing or settling. Otis watched me hear it. "You know what that is?" I said. He set the screwdriver down. "I know it's there. Bernice warned me not to question inconsistencies." At that, he rubbed a thumb along the edge of the relay casing and gave a slow nod, as if a sequence he had expected had finally completed. "Then you've gotten farther than most." I told him about the authorization slip, the missing file, the altered references, the voice under the floor. I didn't say everything. I left out the note about Nadia's access log and the exact shape of my guilt because shame has a way of preserving its own privacy, even when it is killing you. Otis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he went to a locker, opened it, and took out an old ring of tagged service keys. "There are places in this building I wasn't supposed to see," he said. "Plaster breaks, water gets where it shouldn't. Old campuses are full of lies held together by maintenance budgets. You've been down there." He didn't answer at once. The fluorescent light over us gave a tiny, tired buzz. Somewhere in the pipes, water shifted with a low iron groan. "Once," he said. Or enough of once to know I didn't want a second look. "What is it?" He leaned back against the bench. "Not storage. And that's what folks call anything they don't want to explain, but storage doesn't stamp. Storage doesn't sort. It doesn't spit one file out after chewing another to dust." What I saw looked like a records office designed by a machine that thought paper was flesh and facts were parts. The sentence should have sounded theatrical. It didn't. Otis spoke the way mechanics do when they know exact language matters more than comfort. He told me about a service chase behind the dehumidifier bank, a locked grate that shouldn't have opened, a stair he had never seen on any current plan. "Dry heat down there," he said. "Wrong for an archive. Ozone strong enough to sting the nose. Endless metal tables, rollers, date stamps, cutter heads, cabinets deeper than the walls could account for, pages feeding themselves into sorted trays." And he said there were names on drawer tabs that blurred if you looked too long, like the ink couldn't decide whether it belonged. "I thought it was some obsolete records automation," he said. Then I found a personnel card on the floor. Had a custodian's name on it. Benny Ladd. I took it upstairs to ask who he was, and nobody remembered him. Not facilities, not payroll. Nothing in the system. I took the card back the next night and it was gone. As if in answer, the terminal mounted on the wall behind him woke from sleep. Its green text flickered, refreshed, and displayed a catalog pre-entry without any prompt. Personal file. Ladd, Benjamin Oren. Status pending review. My mouth went dry all over again. "Did you do that?" Otis didn't move. I don't touch catalog entries if I can help it. I stepped to the screen and searched the staff directory. No Benny Ladd, no Benjamin Ladd, No one in facilities with that surname, now or archived. I pulled up old work order histories. There were references to repairs completed in a handoff sequence that jumped from one technician to another, leaving a pattern-shaped gap. The screen glowed quietly, patiently, as if it had simply offered useful information. I turned back to Otis. How do you still remember him? Maybe because I found the card before it was finished. He shrugged, but there was no comfort in it. Maybe because maintenance touches the underside of a place. Maybe because some things don't like being watched by people who fix systems for a living. That should have been the end of it. A strange confession in a workroom, due to a terminal glitch. A man telling me to go home. Instead, Otis did something that made the rest inevitable. He handed me one of the service keys, a long brass key with an unmarked head worn smooth by use. Loading corridor, last fire door, panel on the left, he said. There's a latch behind the inspection plate. It opens to a stair. I don't recommend it. Then why give me the key? His eyes moved to the terminal, still displaying Benny Ladd's name as if waiting for instruction. Because if the annex has started writing on you directly, staying upstairs won't stop it. That was the third revelation. The problem was not that a hidden place existed beneath the archive. The problem was that it had begun to recognize me as material. When I left Otis's workroom, the static from his radio followed me into the corridor like distant rain. And by 4 in the morning, the annex had stopped pretending to be a workplace and had become a test. I went back to my desk first, because habits survive fear longer than courage does. The processing room smelled stronger now, paper dry enough to taste, mildew lifting from the concrete as the night cooled, ozone prickling at the back of my sinuses. My terminal was awake. On the screen was my employee profile, only it wasn't mine anymore, not completely. Name, Alistair Boone Kessler. Position, night processing assistant. I stared, blinked, refreshed. Same result. My permanent archivist classification was gone. The hire date had shifted back 3 years. My credentials had been trimmed like excess paper from a stack. There was no doctorate listed under education, only incomplete graduate study. I checked internal access permissions. Restricted collections authorization revoked. Senior handling certification absent. A dozen small professional facts I had earned over years had evaporated into the kind of provisional status that could be dismissed with a form letter. At first, I thought I was misremembering which screen I had opened. Then the profile updated while I was looking at it. Not loaded, updated. My office extension disappeared. My keycard clearance dropped from full stack access to supervised only. The line describing prior service in the annex as a doctoral assistant flickered, glitched once, and rewrote itself to temporary student employment, records uncertain. My skin went cold and tight over my skull. I opened another window, then another. HR directory, department listing, archived newsletters. And in the winter newsletter from the year I had been hired permanently. The paragraph welcoming me to the staff still existed, but my name in it had been replaced with vacant line pending appointment. No, I said aloud to no one. The word barely left my mouth before the printer beside my desk woke with a grinding cough and began spitting pages. Hot paper slid into the tray carrying the sharp chemical smell of fresh toner. I grabbed the top sheet. It was a revised internal history of the annex, a routine orientation packet. In the old version, I had helped design the night processing workflow after returning from graduate work. In the new version, Bernice had done it alone. I read the paragraph twice, and on the third read a sensation pass through me so strange I still don't have honest language for it. Not pain, not dizziness, but it felt as if a shelf in my head had been bumped hard enough to misalign everything resting on it. I knew I had worked on that workflow. I remembered the spreadsheet, the meetings, the stupid arguments about labeling color. but the memory lucid, not gone, just no longer anchored to the world outside me. The page changed again in my hands. My employment history was not merely being hidden, it was being reconciled. That was escalation, if you want a clean term for it. Not the supernatural kind, not a monster leaping from shadow. Administrative escalation, worse because it used the tools I understood. Revision history, access privileges, personnel records. The slow bureaucratic violence of a system deciding what had always been true. I ran to the faculty corridor upstairs, needing something physical, something outside a terminal, and the hall there held framed departmental photographs in chronological rows. Glossy group portraits of conferences, retirements, endowed chairs, smiling committees with nameplates beneath. The carpet muffled my steps. The building above ground smelled different, less like paper and more like radiator heat and old varnish. But beneath it, I still caught that dry, burning edge from below. At the end of the hall, two late working faculty members stood beside a photograph from 3 years earlier, talking in low voices. One of them was Professor Halloran from political science. The other, a woman from chemistry whose name I couldn't immediately retrieve. They nodded at me politely and kept talking. Then Professor Halloran glanced at the photograph, frowned, and stepped closer. I followed his gaze, and there had been 5 people in the front row of that picture. I had passed it every week for months. Now there were 4 with a shallow, impossible gap in the arrangement, shoulders angled toward empty air as if someone had just stepped out of frame between exposures. The engraved plate below still had 5 names, but as we watched, the 4th line lost its letters one by one until it became a blank strip of brass. The chemistry professor stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Her expression changed, not to shock, but to the mild confusion of someone who had misplaced a thought. "Wasn't this?" Halloran began, then trailed off. He looked at me. Funny. I thought there were more of us at that award. He said it lightly. A man noting nothing more than a printer error on the wall beside the frame, and the reflected overhead lights wavered. I smelled hot dust and ozone. Halloran's face smoothed. He shrugged. "No, never mind. Same crowded bunch as always." He walked away mid-conversation, and the other professor followed him, already discussing an entirely different matter. I stood alone in the corridor, looking at a photograph that had just erased a person without even the courtesy of catastrophe. That was the moment I understood Bernice's word: corrections. By the time I got back downstairs, the annex had gone unnaturally still. No page whisper, no click from the compact shelving. Only the steady, patient stamping from beneath, closer now, like a heart heard through a wall. I opened my terminal one more time and searched my own dissertation title. No results found, and that was the last uncomplicated proof of myself I ever expected the institution to offer. And it was gone before dawn. The service door Otis had described was at the far end of the loading corridor, past flat files, deaccessioned exhibit cases, and a row of obsolete scanners waiting for disposal. The farther I walked, the colder the concrete got underfoot, until the air changed abruptly near the last fire door and turned warm and dry, as though a vent hidden in the wall were breathing on me from the wrong side. The smell hit next. Ozone, machine heat, singed paper, and underneath it all the dense, sweet dust of records handled too often. The inspection plate came off with a torque wrench from facilities. Behind it was a recessed latch painted over so many times it had fused to the metal. The brass key Otis gave me fit anyway. I remember pausing with my hand on the latch and thinking, with absurd clarity, that Rule 2 had already been broken. Rule 6 had been ignored, and Rule 4 was only a matter of time. My heart was beating too fast to feel useful. My mouth tasted like old cotton. When the latch released, a seam opened in the wall and breathed hot, dry air into my face. The stair beyond was concrete and narrow, dropping farther than the annex should physically have allowed. No fluorescent lights. Instead, low industrial fixtures ran along the wall behind wire cages, casting a yellow administrative gloom that made everything look already archived. The whisper of pages came from below, layered over the mechanical stamping until the two sounds formed a rhythm. Turn, stamp, turn, stamp. Halfway down, my own name drifted up through the stairwell in a voice almost, but not quite, my own. I kept walking. The sub-basement was not a room, it was an operation. The stair opened onto a floor so wide the caged lights couldn't hold the walls. Metal conveyors crossed the dark in ordered lines. Date stamp mechanisms the size of filing cabinets rose and fell with hydraulic certainty, pressing red marks onto stacks of forms that fed themselves forward without hands touching them. Cutter heads slid through bundles of paper, trimming margins, severing staples, slicing out sections that dropped into locked bins marked pulp recovery. On one long bank of tables, fresh pages rolled from printers in continuous sheets were cut, stacked, collated, and inserted into folders before being routed into cabinets on automated tracks. And the air was warm enough to dry my eyes. It tasted of toner, dust, and faint acid from old paper. Everywhere I looked, labels shifted. Drawer tabs changed names between blinks. Alpha ranges adjusted: personnel, donor, conduct, disciplinary, admissions, payroll. Birth records, though the university had no reason to hold those. Death notices, though I never found evidence that any office had filed them upstairs. Rows of cabinets stretched into the dimness, and some of their contents flickered at the edge of legibility. Names phasing in and out as if existence itself were being indexed in real time. This was the fourth revelation. The archive did not preserve what had happened. It processed what was allowed to remain true. I moved between tables in a kind of careful disbelief, every professional instinct still trying to classify the impossible in front of me. The machines were old and new at once. Some parts looked cast in the 1950s, heavy and blunt, while others carried touch panels with no visible interface logic. There were no operators that I could see, only the system cycling itself through endless review. Above one sorting rack, a mechanical arm lifted a file, stamped it, and sent it down the left chute. Overhead, somewhere unseen, pages whispered through ducts. Then a drawer near me slid open by itself. Inside was a file with a faculty member's name I recognized. Living, tenured, someone I had passed in the corridor the day before. The tab glowed wetly under the light as if the ink had just been laid down. A second file rose behind it, presenting itself half an inch farther out. Alistair Boone Kessler. I didn't touch mine first. I took the faculty file because denial still likes to wear professionalism. Inside were personnel reviews, committee service records, payroll summaries, all ordinary. Then a final sheet on pink administrative stock. Status pending inconsistency review. Adjacent record contamination probable. A machine to my left stamped another file with a violent downward strike. Removed. The sound hit me like a blow, not to the ear, but somewhere behind the face. For one blank second, I forgot the name of the professor whose file I was holding. It vanished cleanly, leaving only the certainty that I had known it a moment before. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, fingertips slipping on the fine dust of paper fibers. That was not metaphor. I felt a piece of memory go, but I set the file down and reached for my own with both hands. Inside was my life, or some version the system had assembled. Birth certificate copy, school records, graduate admissions, course evaluations, employment paperwork. Small things I had forgotten until I saw them, like a parking appeal from my first winter in Burlington and a reimbursement request for photocopy charges. Between them were pages that had never existed in any official file I should have been able to access. Notes in my own hand, drafts of emails unsent, a yellow intake slip I recognized before I understood why. Nadia's supervised access authorization, the one I had removed years ago. Only now the note field contained an extra sentence in my handwriting, added beneath the original approval line. Temporary exception granted. I'm better one compromised student than institutional loss. I don't know whether I had ever thought those exact words or only their shape. Seeing them written there felt like intimacy weaponized. The sub-basement did not merely know what I had done. It knew the private sentence beneath the public act. Accurate enough, isn't it? Bernice's voice came from behind me. I turned so hard the folder bent in my hands. She stood at the end of the aisle in the yellow industrial light, calm as ever, cardigan buttoned, glasses low on her nose, a ring of cabinet keys at her waist. In that place, she didn't look out of scale. Upstairs, I had always thought of her as a person enduring an institution. Down here, she looked like part of its workflow. You knew, I said. She came closer, unhurried, her shoes making almost no sound on the concrete. I knew before you did that the annex had started reconciling around you. You led it? Of course I did. There was no malice in it. That made it worse. Bernice stopped beside a shred feed and rested one hand on the housing as if it were a familiar animal. I was exactly where you are once. I thought records preserved truth. Then I learned something archivists almost never say plainly. Records preserve authority first. Truth, if it survives, does so by negotiation. This isn't a threat, it's a ratio. Sometimes those are the same thing. She reached into a nearby tray and lifted a file labeled with the name of a living faculty member. I knew the man. Everyone did. Bernice met my eyes while she fed the file into the shred mechanism. The rollers caught. Paper tore in fast, dry bites. At the far end of the aisle, mounted on a pole for indexing reference, a small staff photograph shimmered. One face in the back row faded as I watched, leaving a tidy arrangement of shoulders around absence. The foil of her expression never changed. Not triumph, not regret, administrative composure. That was the fifth revelation. Bernice had not been serving the annex out of fear. She had chosen conversion because she believed consistency was kinder than contradiction. I stayed, she said softly, because someone has to keep it from becoming careless. You call this careful? I call it survivable. For the institution, for the records, for most people above us who never know a correction occurred. Her gaze dropped to the file in my hands. You think this began tonight because you found a future signature. And it began the first time you altered the record knowingly. The annex notices those who collaborate before they ever notice those who rebel. The sentence landed harder than accusation. Collaborate. She had given me the word I had withheld from myself for years. You told me to protect the university. I told you institutions remember their protectors. I did not promise the memory would remain yours. For a long moment, the only sounds were the turn of unseen pages, the periodic crash of stamp heads, and the low mechanical breath moving through the sub-basement like climate control for a reality no one upstairs understood they were renting. Who built this? I asked. Bernice gave the smallest shake of her head. Wrong question. Old campuses grow organs the way governments do. Enough generations of filing, restricting, amending, even sealing. And eventually the process stops needing human invention. It only needs human cooperation. You expect me to cooperate now. I expect you to understand your options. She led me to a central table where several files had been laid out already, as if in anticipation of our conversation. Nadia's altered references, my personnel packet, a reconstructed disciplinary review that had never officially existed. On top was a final file thicker than the rest with my name on the tab and a red routing slip clipped to the cover. pending removal. Inconsistency source. Under that, in smaller type, linked unresolved subject, solace, Nadia. The room seemed to tilt without moving. Heat pressed against my face. My fingertips had gone bloodless. Bernice touched the corner of Nadia's access note. And the annex cannot fully erase her because you did not erase her cleanly. You removed enough truth to destroy her life, but not enough to stabilize the lie. That's why she keeps surfacing. Footnotes, variant spellings, residual references. She is a discrepancy with roots. And me? You are the cause attached to the discrepancy. Restore the record, and the annex resolves around the corrected truth. It will treat you as the contradiction that made correction necessary. Destroy the remaining fragments permanently, and the system can settle the original version. Your own status will stabilize. I looked from Nadia's note to my file to the red line that called me a source, not a person. You're asking me to choose whether she exists. Bernice did not flinch. I am telling you that you already chose once, and this is simply the first time the paperwork has been honest about it. That should have made the decision easy. It did not. The table was warm from the machinery beneath it. The air smelled like hot paper and the dry bitterness of toner. Somewhere to my right, a date stamp struck and struck and struck, each blow marking some unseen file into permanence. I stood between the evidence of a woman I had helped erase and the evidence of myself being prepared for similar treatment, and for a long time I could not move. If I restored Nadia's record, I would confirm everything I had buried. The note, the access authorization, the chain of institutional cowardice dressed up as stewardship. The annex would correct the inconsistency by removing the one who had created it. Bernice believed that. After what I had seen, I believed it too. And if I destroyed the fragments, I might walk upstairs with my employment history restored, my dissertation back in the system, my office extension returned, my name fixed to the world like it had always been. Nadia would not merely remain ruined. She would become fully non-existent. No appeal. No vanished scholar somewhere living under another name. No person left even in damaged reference. Just a clean institutional lie so thorough no one could suffer for it because no one would have existed to suffer. That was the moral shape of it. Not life versus death. Truth versus coherence. A woman I had once found convenient to sacrifice, and the self I had built on having gotten away with it. Bernice waited with terrible patience. "I won't force your hand," she said. "That's generous." "It isn't. Forced corrections are rough. Voluntary submissions integrate better." Even then, even there, she spoke in procedures. That was what made her frightening. Not fanaticism. Accommodation. The calm of someone who had translated horror into workflow and could therefore live with it. I picked up Nadia's note again. The paper was warm. On the back, in pencil so faint I almost missed it, there was a line of handwriting I recognized as hers from an old reading room registration card. "If the record goes missing, ask Boone Kessler. He saw me there." My breath stopped. She had known. Maybe not everything, maybe only enough. But she had known exactly where the proof had passed, and she had left herself a route back through me in case the institution did what institutions do. The intimacy of it nearly undid me. Not because she trusted me, but because she had understood I might fail her, and had still written my name down as the last witness. That was the sixth revelation, and the worst one. I had not betrayed an abstraction. I had betrayed a person who had already anticipated the shape of my betrayal. Bernice saw the change in my face. "What is it?" I turned the note so she could read the pencil line. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely tired. "I never saw that." "No," I said. "You taught me well enough to hide it." The machines kept working. Nothing paused for conscience. A file entered a sorter. A fresh page printed. Somewhere in the dark, a drawer closed on a name I would never know existed. "Listen to me," Bernice said, and now there was urgency beneath the composure. "If you submit a corrected record, you will not be thanked. You will not be remembered as noble. You may not retain enough continuity to understand what you saved. The annex does not reward confession, it only resolves it." "I know." "You could still leave with a life." I almost laughed then, not from courage, but from the absurdity of hearing survival offered in the same tone someone might use for an early retirement package. "A life built on what?" I asked.
Alistair.
A filed absence. Bernice did not answer.
Strong.
Maybe there was no right answer. The outline of one had been destroyed years earlier when I made the first decision for the wrong reason and called it maturity. That was why this part lasted as long as it did. People imagine moral choices happen in flashes, character revealed in one clean motion. They don't. They happen under fluorescent lights, breathing dust, and while your hands sweat on paper and someone reasonable explains the benefits of your own worst instinct. I thought about the corridor upstairs, the photograph smoothing itself around a vanished person. I thought about my dissertation title blinking out of the system. I thought about Nadia standing at my desk years ago trying not to speak too quickly, trusting the archive because she still believed documents existed to protect the vulnerable from memory's convenience. I thought about my name beneath hers in a file that treated us as linked errors, cause, and correction. Then I saw, with sudden sick clarity, what the annex had really been doing all night. It had not been punishing me. It had been offering me symmetry. I had turned omission into policy once already. The system was only asking whether I wished to formalize it. I took the corrected access note, the surviving cross-references, the altered committee memo, and every fragment that still tied Nadia Solis to reality. Bernice stepped aside. She did not help me, but she did not stop me. On the far end of the central table sat an intake slot marked Reconciliation Review. Above it, a small green light waited, steady as office equipment. "After this," Bernice said quietly, "there may be very little of you left that recognizes why you did it." I gathered the papers into alignment, squared the edges the way archivists do by reflex, and slid them into the slot. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the machinery changed pitch. The whisper of pages surged through the sub-basement all at once, not chaotic but immense, as if thousands of files were being thumbed open in rapid succession. Stamps fired in chain reactions. Conveyors reversed. Cabinets unlocked and slammed. Warm air gusted across the room, carrying the sharp smell of toner and a sweeter smell beneath it. Not burning now, but rain on dust, like a space opened after years shut tight. On the table beside me, my own file snapped open to its last page. Pending removal. Inconsistency source. The red stamp lifted. Bernice said my name, but I barely heard it. The stamp came down. I did not lose consciousness. I wish I had. Instead, I felt the correction move through me in distinct administrative passes. First, my chest tightened until breathing seemed like something I had to remember from paperwork. Then a pressure behind my eyes, then that same shelving shift inside the head, only deeper, larger, whole runs of memory slipping against each other as if their labels no longer matched. I knew Nadia's name. I knew the annex. I knew there had been a choice. But parts of the why began to loosen immediately, filing themselves somewhere I could not follow. Across the room, drawers opened in fast sequence. New tabs flashed into place. Somewhere above us, or perhaps only in my mind, phones began ringing in offices where someone suddenly existed again. A dissertation record repopulated. A faculty complaint file amended. A grant review note acquired a missing attachment. The system was not chaotic in correction. It was meticulous. That was the last thing about it that frightened me. When I looked up, Bernice was standing very still, both hands flat on the table, watching me with an expression I had once mistaken for detachment. And it was grief, pared down until it could survive professional life. "It doesn't end in death," she said almost to herself. "Not always." I tried to answer, I don't know if I did. The next clear memory I have is of the loading corridor. Cold concrete under my palm, a service light buzzing overhead. Otis kneeling in front of me with one hand on my shoulder and the other wrapped around a mug that smelled like machine oil and stale coffee. He said, "Stay with me." I remember the words because they sounded like instructions for a repair. They got me upstairs before dawn, not through any dramatic escape. Bernice knew routes that bypassed cameras and attention because of course she did. The annex above had resumed its practiced quiet. The air was cooler there. Paper dust settled in familiar layers, and the stamping from below had receded into the foundation as if nothing extraordinary had happened. By morning, several things were true. Nadia Solis existed in the system. Her dissertation registration had been restored. The disciplinary review now included the supervised access note. Her appeal file reflected procedural mishandling by the archive and faculty oversight. There were emails in the university servers that staff treated as if they had always been there. People spoke her name with the bland recognition reserved for resolved institutional embarrassment. Also true, my own records were damaged beyond ordinary explanation. Not absent, worse, incomplete. My staff file contained employment gaps, unsigned forms, contradictory start dates, missing credentials. And a personnel officer I had known for years looked at me with the professional caution one reserves for contractors who claim longer affiliation than paperwork supports. My dissertation remained gone. My office key worked some days and failed on others. In one departmental directory, I appeared as A.B. Kessler, temporary archival support. In another, there was no entry at all. Bernice did not vanish. She continued working. That, more than anything, kept her ambiguous in my mind. She had not tried to save me from the decision, but neither had she punished me for making it. Once, weeks later, she passed me a folder in silence, and her fingers paused against mine for just a second longer than necessary. The closest she ever came to an apology. Otis remembered more than anyone had a right to. He said the lower machinery ran quieter after that night, as if a jam had cleared deep in the system. He never went below again. Neither did I, not physically. The permanent change was smaller than I expected. No dramatic scar, no spectral affliction. It arrived as a habit. To this day, if someone says my full name from another room, I do not answer until I can see their face. I wait. I listen for concrete under the voice. Months passed, maybe longer. Time after correction had a way of becoming administrative itself, divided into forms, access renewals, careful errands through a campus that no longer held me in all the places it once had. I retained enough to assemble this account, though not enough to trust every motive in it. That is the remaining cruelty. I know what I did. I know I reversed it. I do not know whether, and in the last clear second before the stamp fell, I acted from conscience, guilt, self-loathing, or the simple exhaustion of being finally described accurately by the system I had served. Loop back far enough and perhaps those become the same thing. Late one winter evening, long after the annex had reassigned me to tasks too minor to threaten consistency, I stood outside the glass office on the processing floor and watched a woman I had never met unpack her desk. New hire, night archivist, according to the temporary badge still clipped to her sweater. Bernice had retired the month before with no ceremony anyone could remember arranging. The new woman moved with the cautious efficiency of someone learning a building's moods. Dry paper air gathered around her. The low whisper of unattended pages rose and fell in the corridor. Beneath the floor, very faintly, something stamped once. She opened a transfer card, sorted a stack of intake materials, and paused over a file that had no place in any normal handoff. I could read the tab through the glass. Alistair Boone Kessler. Incomplete record. She frowned, sat down, and opened it. I stayed where I was, just beyond the office light, while she turned the first page and searched her own memory for a person the annex had not left enough of me behind to become. When she said my name, it was only to hear how a stranger sounded in the room.